we are going to do a deep dive. It's been quite a bit since I've done one, and I've been waiting to do this one, and now seems like the right time. I saw Kamala Harris once again yelling at protesters during this book tour, a more recent one that was in DC. You know, she's on this tour for her book. And I had to stop and think, how did we get here? Right. And sometimes to figure out how we got here, you really kind of got to go back and look through history a little bit. And one person that I've looked at quite a bit is Malcolm X. You see, I think it's important to understand that the way that you get to a Kamala Harris or Barack Obama downplaying the suffering of the Palestinian people, capitulating with the oppression and the occupation, even prior to October 7th, the way that you get there is because of what Malcolm X warned us about a long time ago. Malcolm X gave a stern warning of what was starting and what was to come if people didn't wake up. And unfortunately, we moved away from Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Assata Shakur, the revolutionary leaders back in that day. And we started to embrace something called neoliberalism. And contrary to what people may believe, neoliberalism doesn't mean that you are liberal. Neoliberalism applies to both parties. And neoliberalism, in my opinion, is what paved the way for the genocide in Gaza, the Kamala Harrises of the country, the Barack Obamas, and I want to show you how. Malcolm X said this long ago. I want everyone to hear what he says. Pay close attention.
There are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox. And a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to. But the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling and you take him for a friend.
You will take him for a friend. You see, before people started to focus so much on we got to support and vote for the Democratic Party, there were people that you could look up to try to get these things accomplished outside of electoral politics, like a Fred Hampton, like a Malcolm X. Malcolm X understood that politically was not the way to go, that focusing on the liberal politics or the conservative politics was ultimately not going to lead to equality and was not going to lead to any sort of liberation for Black people in this country. Now, he goes on to explain this in a little bit more detail because I want people to understand how we got a Kamala Harris, how we got a genocide, how we got journalists making an excuse for a genocide. This is all connected. These aren't separate. We are not separating domestic and geopolitics. I'm going to explain to you because what happens abroad, right? That empire, it comes back home. Listen to this.
I think there are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. Mm-hmm. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. Mm-hmm. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chopped.
This part is important. So if he's describing the two between like the liberals and the conservatives, you know, for obviously for Black people with the conservative party, it's easier to see that, right? Because it's out in the open. They're very like upfront about what they believe, etc. But with the Democrats, they're sneaky, just like he said. Now, this deep dive isn't done to tell you to go join the Republican Party, because what Malcolm X realized is that both were a problem and were going to be a hurdle when it came to equality and Black liberation. And so with the Democrats, with the white liberals. And this ain't to say all of them, but a lot of times they feel as though they are the answer to your problems. They are really good at saying that they approve or they tolerate certain social issues. But that doesn't mean they want it in their backyard. They're the first to say that they support Black Lives Matter, and they'll put a sign in their window to let you know. They're the first to say that I support equal marriage rights for everybody. They're the first to say all of these things. But they're also the first to call the cops on you when you try to move into their neighborhood next door to them. You see, they're okay with you doing those things. They just don't want it next to them. That's a different type. That is the sneakiness that he's talking about. They may not necessarily walk around and call you the N-word to your face. No, they'll just work behind the scenes structurally to make sure that your kids don't go to the schools that their kids go to. They'll work behind the scenes with lawmakers to make sure that the property taxes actually do mean something, damn it. And unless you live in their neighborhood where they have wealthy homes, your kids aren't going to get that same type of quality education. I've seen it firsthand. And for those of us that do live in blue or progressive cities, we'll be the first to let you know how these things really go down. That's the sneaky part. Listen to the rest.
Is play.
I'd like to point out, though, that
And I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro, who actually differs from the white conservative in the same way that the fox differs from the wolf. Their appetite is the same. Their motives are the same. It's only their mannerisms and methods that differ.
Did everybody hear that? They pose as the friend, but their appetite is the same. Their methods and their mannerisms are different. Why is this important when we're talking about how you get the Kamala Harrises, how you end up with the Barack Obamas, how you end up with Black politicians excusing a genocide? After Malcolm X was killed, after Fred Hampton was killed, after Assata Shakur ran away to Cuba, and she was innocent, by the way, that opened the door to neoliberalism. Because without those revolutionary leaders, then the other question was, okay, well, what do we do now? Well, there's always politics. Just put your hope in a politician. This is the issue with neoliberalism. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Neoliberalism and race. Shout out to Derek Hamilton for this. And then we're going to get into who actually started neoliberalism, because believe it or not, it's not Ronald Reagan. He popularized it, but didn't start it. Check this out. Start right about here. Here we go. For the last 45 years, essentially all of the economic gains from America's increasing productivity has gone to the elite and upper middle class, while workers' real wages have remained roughly flat. In their report in 1973, this is coming from the Economic Policy Institute, 1973 serves as the line. Prior to that date, worker gains in terms of real wages increased with an almost lockstep one-to-one relationship with productivity. However, after 1973, despite the continued trend of increased productivity, the promise trickled down to all workers from neoliberal supply-side economics hasn't stopped. This neoliberal political ideology has dominated, maintaining and reinforcing economic concentration. To understand why the status quo of growing inequality persisted, we need to look at the third pillar of this relationship, which is race, or more broadly, the existence of an underclass marked by a socially stigmatized identity. This rose in the 1970s. Neoliberal economics made it implicit or sometimes explicit promise to Black Americans and to the underclass that the rising tide would lift all boats and that the new paradigm would free them from the state's deadening hand that forced them into lives of dependency. Now, let's go back to this part right here. The rising tide would lift all boats. Don't you hear that today? Doesn't that sound a little bit familiar? I told you guys before multiple times, I support the universal programs, but there are other things that need to be done. Because even with like a Bernie Sanders, when he says these universal programs are going to lift all boats, yeah, it's true. It lifts everybody, but it doesn't put everybody on equal footing because someone is still going to be on the bottom. That's the problem when you just focus on the universal policies. If you're at the bottom right now and other people are ahead of you, and I give everybody $100, everybody is lifted, but you're still at the bottom because you had less than everybody else to begin with. Let's go on a little bit more. This piece right here, the promise of economic prosperity and relative racial progress of neoliberal economics for Black Americans has not materialized. In fact, some progress has been reversed. Evidence from the U.S. decennial census reveals tremendous relative racial economic progress for Blacks from 1940, when the typical Black man earned only 45% of a typical white male's earnings, to the 1980 census, when that gap was reduced to about 70% of average white male wages. But this relative progress ceased. Prevailing neoliberal explanations for this reversal have focused on education, individual attitudes, and public sector programs that supposedly generate perverse incentives away from the personal responsibility. The presumption is that if Black people were more responsible, made better financial decisions, and focused on education, they could get a good job and achieve economic security. But studying and working hard hasn't been enough for Black Americans. So let's pause here for just a second. Neoliberalism is to blame for inequality. This is the part I think some people don't want to reckon with. Neoliberalism is to blame for inequality in this country. There was a time in this country where I think it was the period after Reconstruction, where Black people were doing pretty well. And that was because the dollar continued to turn within the Black community. We had Black Wall Streets in this country. There were multiple ones, not just in Tulsa, and they were all burned to the ground. So you see, the things that people like Malcolm X and Fred Hampton and them were fighting for, they weren't just fighting for, okay, we need to have we need to be able to have a seat at the table. There needs to be equality across the board. They were also fighting for this type of economic stability, which did not exist at that point in time. Stay with me here and I'll explain to you how this leads to a Kamala Harris and what you see happening right now with Gaza. Because you see, as we go on, a lot of people, they credit Ronald Reagan as the father of neoliberalism. He made it popular along with Margaret Thatcher. But it didn't start under him. Let's get into this piece here. Neoliberalism policies associated with Reaganomics actually started with Carter. That's Jimmy Carter, and he did not win re-election, right? Check this out. Research has long established strong links between neoliberal policies and increasing rates of inequality. See, here we go again with the inequality, right? So historian David N. Gibbs, he's the author of The Revolt of the Rich, says we mustn't whitewash President Carter's record. And Chris Hedges also talked about this with Jimmy Carter. It goes on to say here, Susan George, for instance, argued quite convincingly that increasing inequality stems from the neoliberal practices of placing public wealth into private hands, enforcing huge tax cuts for the rich, and suppressing the wages for average workers. Let's go down here. Moreover, the study in question argues that the culprit for the impact on attitudes is Thatcherism, right? So they're relating this to Margaret Thatcher. Indeed, most researchers place the origin of the neoliberal counter-revolution in the post-war era with the policies initiated by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the UK and the US, respectively. However, this book here by David Gibbs, he goes on to say that we should look to the administrations of Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter in particular for setting up the foundations for the launching of the neoliberal counter-revolution in the United States. So this is where I think some people get that wrong. They pretend that, they tend to go on and say that Reagan was the one who started it. This actually started a little bit under Nixon, more so under Carter, and then Reagan escalated it. If you look here, this is what the interviewer was asking David Gibbs. The revolt of the rich, you argue that it was actually the Nixon administration that laid the groundwork for the shift to a conservative economic platform, and that it was the Carter administration in turn that ushered in the first wave of neoliberalism. So he asked him to explain a little bit. David Gibbs comes in and says, Richard Nixon aspired to be a transformational president, one who would overturn the regulated capitalism inherited from the New Deal in favor of a free market revolution. He was influenced by laissez-faire worldview of the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman. Goes on to say here, to amplify Friedman's message, Nixon relied on a rightist intellectual network focused on the American Enterprise Institute, a free market bastion. The president leaned on corporate executives to increase their funding of AEI, building it up as a Washington powerhouse. At the same time, the Brookings Institute here, at the same time, the president encouraged executives to defund the centrist Brookings Institute and other rivals to the rising of AEI. Jump forward here. Corporate America would engage in massive influence campaign throughout the 1970s after Watergate, using a dense network of think tanks, lobby groups, and publicity agencies to spread their message. There's something else I got to mention that happened around this time too. One of the things that Richard Nixon promised was to end the war in Vietnam. Does this sound a little bit familiar with what we're dealing with today? So under Nixon, in come the think tanks. We get into Carter. Carter accelerates neoliberalism. And then, of course, you get to Ronald Reagan, who pushes the trickle-down economics and says that this is going to be the way. All the wealth is going to be at the top, but don't worry, it's going to trickle down to the American people, to the working class, which did not happen. The point that I'm trying to make is this. When those revolutionary leaders were killed, particularly within the Black community and Black working class, the next thing to look forward to was neoliberalism. This idea that voting was going to solve the problem. This idea that, we just got to adopt to Reaganomics because Ronald Reagan says all this is going to trickle down to us. And with Fred Hampton gone and with Malcolm X gone, there was no one there to tell you, no, we need to focus on building things outside of this and not get caught up in just hoping and wishing that a politician is going to save us. And because those revolutionary leaders were killed, other members of the community were less willing to step up because they didn't want to be killed. That was how the FBI, the CIA were able to stop and silence the movement on the outside. When you have a presidential candidate that is running and says they're going to stop the war. They're going to make things right. Then they get in, not trying to stop the war. We're talking about the war in Vietnam. And people still struggle economically, probably not as much as they're struggling today. It opens the door for what we have now. Because we didn't have that real opposition. There were protests against the Vietnam War, don't get me wrong. But all the revolutionary leaders, by the time they were all killed off, you didn't have those leaders within the community to say, no, we're going to organize this way. We're not going to buy into the trickle-down economics, and this is how we're going to save our communities and protect our communities. You didn't have that. So when a politician came along and said, just believe in me, have hope in me, that's what people did. When in reality, if people go back and listen to what Malcolm X said, he was right. He warned you way ahead of time that both of those parties, in particular for the Black working class, was not going to produce for the community. Because I believe that Malcolm X knew what was coming. And I think some people forgot about that. Ayoka says, Kwame, you warned us as well. There you go. Right? So if we look forward and we can see this as well, let me add this part here before we get to the Kamala piece. This is under the Carter presidency, right? We're talking about the Committee on Present Danger. So listen to this. The 1970s produced an elite campaign aimed at increasing military spending and reinvigorating U.S. militarism after its failures in Vietnam. Did everybody hear what I just said? After the failures in Vietnam, they didn't say, let's pull back on the wars. Let's pull back on the defense spending. They said, let's increase military spending. So I point this out again. If after seeing women and children being killed on national television during the Vietnam War, if that didn't stop the madness, we were only destined for what was going to happen today. Because that didn't make the government say, we're not going to put more money into wars. We're not going to increase defense spending. They did the exact opposite. Neoliberalism pushed all that. And because they got away with it and they increased defense spending and they continued the wars after everything that people saw was happening in Vietnam, because they got away with it, that's how you get a genocide in Gaza. When people look back and they say they don't understand how people can support what Israel is doing, how people have no sympathy, no feeling for the Palestinian people. If you look back at what I just told you, how there were Americans who were dying in Vietnam, Americans who were drafted against their will to go fight this war the U.S. should have never been in the first damn place. And they were killed. All these caskets coming back to the United States. If the U.S. government was willing to turn a blind eye to the killing and the death of the Americans that were drafted to go fight that war, what makes you think they weren't going to turn a blind eye to a genocide in Gaza? Once they got away with that, what we saw coming in Gaza was only inevitable at some point. If it didn't happen in Gaza, it would have happened somewhere else. So that part there is important for people to see about the defense spending. And that is how you get to a Kamala Harris. You see, Kamala Harris is pissed because she doesn't understand. She's having this book tour, and everywhere she goes, she's getting called out in the audience because she didn't want to withhold arms from Israel that she said herself. Now, this wasn't Code Pink. This was the Climate Defiance. They support the Democratic Party. Look at what they say to Kamala Harris here.
They'll figure out who you are soon enough.
Kamala Harris, you are a right-wing war criminal! You are a right-wing... You funded genocide for 161 days! And Russia was shot 355 times during your administration! You lost the election because you would rather be a Republican than a Democrat! You lost, this is your fault! We have 4 years of Trump because of your 107 days! You are a war criminal! You sold out the youth! You sold out the climate! Shame on you! This is all your fault! This is your fault! We have Trump because this is your fault! Get the fuck out of here.
Something I want to point out, and that young woman is incredibly correct. I want to show you the attitude that Kamala Harris gives here. Watch this. You see this? This attitude that she has here? Let me explain why you have this, right? It's the same reason why Kamala Harris stood up and said, I am speaking to people asking about a genocide. You get this cocky, you get this ego, because neoliberalism has allowed someone like you to be there in the first damn place. Let me make it very clear. What Malcolm X said was right. They pick people like Kamala Harris. They pick people like Barack Obama. White liberals pick these people and put them in front of the black community. He was correct. And they tell you, this is who you are going to support. This is the person that you need to get behind. Who is the exact opposite of Malcolm X? The exact opposite of Fred Hampton. This is not what they told you to do. But that's what the empire wants. She has this attitude because she was selected. She was selected by think tanks, by the Clintons, by white liberals who said, she'll be the one. And she has this attitude because she believes that because she is a black woman, we are supposed to support her. Let me make it very clear. You can't have it both ways. You cannot sit around, some of you walking around and you like, I supported Assata Shakur. Free Assata Shakur, and she's passed away now. But you can't be like, rah, rah, Malcolm X and rah, rah, Kamala Harris. She's the exact opposite. She is what Malcolm X warned you about. And without the death of Malcolm X, without the death of the revolutionary leaders, we don't walk into neoliberalism. We keep organizing within our communities. We don't trust the politician who comes in with the switchy witchy words and the code switching to make they think they down with you, who's never walked in your shoes. You don't get someone who just thinks they deserve it just because they're black and you're black. And so you got to support them. That's how you get that. Without the death of Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, without the fleeing of Assata Shakur, without the death, I'd say MLK, but these peeps were a little bit more, they're a little bit more further out there than MLK. But even with MLK, without them, we don't go to neoliberalism. We don't count on it. We don't embrace it, because the moment we entered neoliberalism, the organizing stopped. And that's exactly what they wanted. That's why she got a problem. She can't take it that people are confronting her. This is how you get a comment where this woman compares deportation to genocide.
I'm not president. And if you want to talk about legacy, let's talk about the legacy of mass deportation of people voting in Donald Trump.
You see?
I'm
not president. No, you're not. And you know why? Why is she not president? Partially because of this issue. Because her not willing to withhold weapons to Israel. So you see, neoliberalism led the way to inequality. Neoliberalism did that. Supported by both sides. Neoliberalism is not just a liberal thing, supported by both sides. This idea that we're going to focus on the wealthy and not the working class. And even within that working class, you have Black people that are even further at the bottom. So when people don't understand, how do you get to this point with Kamala Harris or the statement made by Barack Obama? How do you get to this point where you have basically they are puppets that have been put in front of the Black community? They were selected by white liberals, put in front of you and say, you better support this person. How do you get to this point where this person who prided herself to be a Black woman, at least when she was running, not having that type of empathy and sympathy for the Palestinian people, lying about what Israel really was, backing an oppressor, backing a state that is occupying a group of people? How do you get to that point? You get to that point because neoliberalism made inequality okay. When the government walks away from what happened from the Vietnam War, and their response to that is, yeah, we killed all those Americans. They died over there, and those women and those children in Vietnam died and all that type of stuff. Anyway, we're going to increase the military budget. That's how you get to a Kamala Harris not giving a damn about the genocide in Gaza. And I don't think she really does give a damn. I think she's trying to show some type of sympathy, because if you really gave a damn, you wouldn't sit up there and still take money from AIPAC. You wouldn't sit up there and still take money from these pro-Israel lobbies. You wouldn't sit up there and say you will always stand with Israel. Malcolm X wouldn't have told you stand with Israel. So you can't have it both ways. Pass that on to your friends. There's some people, they want to be like, yeah, Malcolm X was, yeah, go Malcolm X. Yeah, go Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is what Malcolm X told you not to do. That's how you get there. The crimes of the empire come home. Malcolm said this oh so well.
Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
That part. That's how they got there. That's how Kamala got there. That's how Obama got there. That's how Cory Booker got there. So Malcolm X gave us a warning a long time ago. He told us, yeah, it was very clear what was happening, obviously, with the Republican Party, but he was trying to warn you about the Democratic Party as well. And he was trying to tell you, wait a minute now, those liberals, they have the same agenda, but they do it differently. They're sneaky. They're going to come to you as a friend, and then they're going to stab you in the back. So neoliberalism is what got us here. And that's what I want people to really understand. That's why when I say fool me once, you know, I got fooled with Obama big time. I admit that. And if I could go back and change things, I would. I wouldn't have voted for McCain. I probably would have voted third party, or I wouldn't have voted at all. Now, when you bring up the same type of tactics, the same type of energy that Malcolm X spoke about, the same type of energy that Fred Hampton spoke about, you're called fringe. We're going to start changing that. That's not fringe. You know what's fringe? What's fringe is we need to make the Kamala Harris's fringe. We need to make the Barack Obama's fringe. That's what we need to make fringe. And we need to call neoliberalism out for the hell that it is and what it has ultimately done to the working class, and in particular to the Black working class. It's a big reason why a lot of the inequalities still exist. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.